Thanks to everyone for showing up and for participating. I know we're getting plenty of Zooming. I find myself deleting like 5 a day coming into the email. Just can't take any more Zoom. And it's nice to see Sally's here. Sally wrote the first book on the Sally Portman. I mean, she's somewhere. She got pushed off, but and Helen Tresser has Helen, you have to show me that lily. She showed me a picture of a lily that does a wild lily nearby here. She lives near me on the East Side Road, coming up out of the soil in the last spring. And I said, that is not a native lily. She said she would show it to me this spring. So Helen, I see your name. I saw it. I don't see it anymore. Okay, I'm going to try and get the slideshow to come up. We're never very, host disabled.
I have to share it with you, Dana. Sorry, I always forget about that.
That's okay. It's okay.
There we
Got
go.
it?
Got
Okay.
it.
Then we'll go here. And then we'll go here.
There it is.
So we're going alpine. And this is snow de glacia, as it says, and definitely alpine. Somebody queried me. I ran into Melanie yesterday and she said, why are you going alpine? And can't get up there for 3 months. Well, we're talking about wildflowers. You got to get to the alpine wildflowers at some point. They're so endearing, and I'd be hard pressed to say what it is about them. They're mostly miniature. They're right down on the ground. They're hard to get to. You have to hike in miles, and you get to these ridges, and this is on a ridge, the snow de glacia up in the Sawtooths. The snow blows off, I think, and this blooms last week of June, when the meadows are still full of snow in the mountains, the snow de glacia. So I was, putting this together, I started reading about what alpine plants have to put up with. And they point out that the season is extremely short, that the frost all year long, could be frost any time of year, high radiation levels, low atmospheric pressure. That was interesting to me. And we'll talk a little more about that on this slide coming up. But, they have to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And the pressure of the atmosphere is 25% lower at about 7,000 feet. Anyhow, it's a tough life up there. And then what that led my mind to, that I thought I would just touch on, is that actually life on the planet is tenuous. Life is not just tenuous in the alpine zone, but life on the planet is tenuous. And that's, that relates to a subject realm that is sometimes these days known as big history. You may know that it's a subject taught in all over the world now, big history. It's the evolutionary story of life on Earth, but it brings up how tenuous life is, and sort of, you could say, improbable. And so, by way of just a few things that I have written down over here, although I hate looking at my notes, the distance of the Earth from the sun. If it was certainly 5% closer or 5% further, life would not be possible on Earth. It would be too hot or too cold. I'm going to peek here. Oh yeah, the orbital eccentricity. So the Earth orbits the sun. It's not, it's not a perfect circle. That was very hard on the Catholic Church. They wanted everything to be perfect because it was made by God. But it's an ellipse. And the ellipse varies through the years. I mean, the different seasons can be at different points in the ellipse as hundreds and thousands of years go by. If that ellipse was greater, life would not be possible. The Earth would swing further from the Earth, and from the sun, it would just be colder. If it was closer, it'd probably be too hot, and that goes on and on. The Earth has a tilt. It's an average 23.5 degree tilt to the sun. It's tilted. It's tilted because it was hit by a planetesimal, almost for sure. It should be straight up. By the laws of physics, the Earth should be rotating in a plane straight up to the Earth, but the plane is tilted 23 degrees. If it were tilted more, it would be colder in the winter and hotter in the summer. And life wouldn't be the way it is now, and it would likely not be possible. If it was tilted less, there'd be far less diversity in life. If there was no tilt, because the tilt creates the seasons. So I have, being interested in big history, I have 17 pages of these kinds of bits of information. That's sort of, that all deals with the tilt of the earth, but the way that the atoms go together, the orbitals and their hunger for a certain number of electrons, it just goes on and on. I mean, I have 17 pages, and I'm sure you could get 100. The improbability of life on Earth. So I just thought it was a good opportunity to point out it's not just the alpine flowers, but that we can feel lucky that we're here at all. Moving right along. So alpine environment. So at the bottom there, there's a resource. If you Google it, you'll get it. It's called Plant Life in the Cold. And there's a little more, Arctic and alpine environments. If you Google plant life in the cold, I found when I tried that, it was the fourth one down. If you do the whole title. So it's a PDF. It's just interesting. And that's where this page came from. And I have one other page from there. Pictures of alpine plants from all over the world. I found it quite interesting. So alpine environments, difficult place for life. And of course, at a certain point, life peters out. There are places, I mean, on Everest, the highest flowers are 20,000 feet. Well, Everest is 29,000 feet. There's no flowers at the top. It's just too much. You just get beyond the range of what life can handle. What are the parameters? Here's a few. We know low temperatures, long-lasting snow, terrible habitats for life. There's no soil to speak of, except maybe in the wet meadows, but not on the cliffs, not on the scree. The scree's moving. The fell fields that we'll talk about, where they're just covered with rocks that have fallen off the cliffs. Temperatures undesirable. The wind is unbelievable. It desiccates, dries out the plants. And then down at the bottom, the partial pressure is reduced. What does it say? By 25% at about 7,000 feet. Well, it's not something we usually think about, but as I like to emphasize, plants are largely made out of carbon dioxide. I don't know if anybody would argue that, but if you count up actually the weight, the daltons, the weight of the protons and the neutrons of glucose, which is the product of photosynthesis, it's 9% carbon and oxygen, and the hydrogen comes from the water. Photosynthesis splits the water. Anyhow, carbon dioxide has to get in through those tiny microscopic holes called stomata. I don't know how they do it. There's no pump inside the plant. I presume the partial pressure is less inside the plant. Maybe the plant has a way of arranging that. I'm sure Google would know. I didn't have time to look it up. But the point is, there's less carbon dioxide and there's less oxygen at higher altitudes, and yet these plants are able to persist. This is avalanche lily. Sometimes we call it glacier lily. So a lot of these pictures I didn't take, and I can't remember some of them, but these I did take. I remember late June on the Maple Pass Loop, for those of you who are anywhere nearby. And so there's one ancillary comment to make about the Maple Pass Loop. I talked to somebody about it yesterday, and they said, we don't go there anymore. It's too crowded. And I went up there last September, and there were cars lining the highway. Highway 20. They weren't just in the parking lot and in the entrance to the parking lot, they were lining. I guess people are just starved to get out. I'd never seen anything like it. And I turned around and left. But I will say, if you go the last week of June, there's going to be a little snow on the trail. You can get through it. There won't be any people. And so my real point here is that these erythroniums are melting their way through the snow as if they're warm-blooded. How do they do it? Well, all it takes is a little metabolism. They stored the energy of the sun in the hydrocarbon bonds in their roots. That's what photosynthesis is all about. And when they recombine, when they break that hydrogen away from the carbon by combining it with oxygen, the metabolism, it gives off a little bit of heat. And that is how they create that heat. And they're able to bloom here before the snow actually melts. So they're well adapted. I was surprised. So you can look up, by the way, you can always look up these Latin and Greek terms. So grandiflorum is not too tough, right? Big flower. Erythronium, if you look it up, it means red flower. So it's fun to know. terms don't always fit the flower. There must be a lily that's red. One more from that PDF program. I found the species diversity of the commentary on alpine diversity and then compared to Arctic diversity interesting. So if we look through it, say at the high end, 15,000 species in alpine environments around the world. The alpine environment is 3% of the world's land and has 6% of the world's flora. Arctic environments, 5% of the world's land and 1% of the world's flora. And the point is that surprisingly, alpine environments are biodiversity hotspots. Arctic, not so much. And so then, if you want to be biological about it, you need to wonder why that's the case. It's fun to ask questions, why would the diversity be so much higher in the mountains than in Arctic environments? And we're not going to go into that. I'm just pointing out that you can always carry these subjects on and ask questions about them. So back to Snowdoglossia and alpine forget-me-not. These plants grow up in the Sawtooth Range, between the Methow Valley and Lake Chelan. So Snowdoglossia, which is Douglasia nivea, which means snow. Nivea means snow. Douglasia is named after David Douglas, and David Douglas is I don't like naming plants after people, and many of them are, but David Douglas is a worthy figure to name a plant after. It's fascinating to read about his life. Jack Nisbet has a good book on David Douglas, and I think he died at 35. He did all his adventuring, died in Hawaii of all places at 35 or so, and still was one of the most famous botanists ever. So Douglasia is named after him. And he wandered around the American Northwest several times by himself. I mean, he encountered Native Americans all the time, but he didn't travel with them so much. He was by himself. I mean, that is a courageous act. He didn't even know the landscape. There were no maps. It's just astonishing what he did. So Snowdoglossia is in the primrose family. We've briefly mentioned some of the characters of the families, and I'd be hard pressed. The petals are fused, and I have it in my notes, but I'm not going to look for it. And forget-me-nots in the borage family, it's a little easier to remember a few characters of the borage family. Those petals are fused together as well. Borages are typically quite hairy, and those leaves are quite hairy. You can't quite see it in the picture. And a lot of borages have a bump in the throat of the corolla called a fornix, which means I forget what it means. It means something like ridge or bump, something like that. Anyhow, there's one on each petal, and it closes up the opening to the reproductive organs, which are inside that little hole. So it limits who can pollinate those flowers. But another interesting aspect of the fornices on the corolla of the forget-me-not is they change color after the flower has been pollinated. So there are some there that are fairly pink. The fresh flowers are yellow, and that pink color is harder for insects to see. It's a little bit like a stoplight. It communicates to insects that that flower's already been pollinated, and there's no reason to visit it because there's probably no pollination reward, whether that's pollen or nectar, I don't know. Anyhow, it's almost as if these things have a brain. They act like they do. I should, there's this, I guess I have it in my notes a little later. Oh yeah, so there's a penny in that picture. I like to conceal the penny. I buried it a little bit. So I went up into the sawtooths. I know where these are. I tell you the truth, I go up every year. I've gone up every year for 20 years. I'm so enamored of this site and these plants. So it's 7 miles uphill the whole way, as mountain ridges are always. So one year I went up a month later, which would be like early July, and gathered seeds, brought them home, planted them, had to stratify them. You can read about these things. I have one. I'm no good at growing alpines, but I do have a book on it. It's fun to read. Stratified those seeds which means, you treat them the way they would be treated in nature. I put the little pots out in the snow, out on the ground, and they were buried by the snow for the whole winter. And then the snow melted, and they'd gone through sort of a normal winter. Several of them germinated. I put them in my little rock garden. This one produced one flower, and then the whole plant died. This is famously difficult to grow. So I don't know if that's to be considered a success or not a success, but that's how it went. And that shows you the size. And so if you want to study this flower, this is how you do it. This is Maggie Kuhn. Many of you know Maggie. About a long time ago, 10 years ago when we were up there, but you can't see them. You have to get, not only is it a belly flower, but it's a fully prostrate flower. You have to lie down, and she's looking with her hand lens to capture the beauty of those little flowers. They're delightful. And of course, you have this extreme delicacy in the most difficult growing habitat possibly on the planet. So it's very touching. I have it in my notes. I thought this interesting phrase, the plants have a genetic expectation, just that phrase, of the habitat they will find themselves in, which is to say, if you bring the plant home and if you can get it to grow, it's still going to be an alpine plant. It's not going to grow tall, because the information for how to interact with the environment that it has evolved in is built into the genetic structure of the plant. And so it's going to grow as if it's in an alpine environment, no matter where it finds itself. This is up in that area, and that's Snow Douglasia, and then an anemone that we're going to talk about, Drummond's anemone. And that's a fell field. I don't know if I'm supposed to go into fell fields here, but so many of these things, I don't think about these things until someone points them out to me. And I guess we can help one another in that way. Big history calls it collective learning, that the whole human enterprise is based on collective learning. And the reasons humans stand out as a mammal are different than the other mammals is because of collective learning, because we pass information on, not only from one person to another, from generation to generation. So that's how we learn. This is a fell field. Fell field is a pile of rocks, very common up in the mountains. Fell is a Gaelic word for stone. So it's a stone field, a field of stones. It's a difficult growing environment, exposed to the wind, almost no humus in the soil, so no moisture retention. And somehow life has adapted to grow in these environments. In symbiotic relationships, these flowers have to be pollinated. So that means there must be pollinators, insects up there, but it's challenged. And if you read about alpine plants, they're challenged to successfully, even if the plant is alive, they're challenged to successfully reproduce in the short growing season window that they have. So this is that anemone that was somewhat visible in the previous picture, Drummond's anemone. Drummond was a botanist in the 1800s. It's a beautiful flower, and part of the beauty is that I don't remember exactly. I seem to be remembering those may all be sepals and not petals. It would just be a physiological, what they develop from. If they're petals and sepals, then they're tepals. They all look the same. I think maybe they're all sepals. In any case, they have that delightful purplish blue cast on the underside, and then they're white in the middle. And actually, I was looking at this. It struck me for the first time this morning when I was looking at this picture that remember that insects are attracted to anything closer to violet and ultraviolet, less so to red, and sometimes invisible. They're blind to red. So the undersides of these are close to violet. And that's going to be very attractive to the insect. The inside is white, and white is going to reflect the energy arriving from the sun onto the reproductive structure. So they're going to heat up more rapidly than if it was another color. So that's my effort to interpret why this flower is colored this way. And that's our prerogative. Once we realize that all these things are adapted to their environment, we have the fun of interpreting them. And if you don't tell anybody else, you're never wrong with your interpretation. It's a great plant. Dryas octopetala. Octopetala means 8 petals. There's 16 petals on those flowers. It's like penstemon means 5 stamens, and they have 4, whatever. They often have 8, but they have as many as 16. Dryas means, so you can, if you want to find out these names, if you go to Google, type in Dryas, and then type etymology, E-T-Y, etymology, and you'll get several versions of what that name means. So that's how I found out. Dryas means from, I forget actually, probably Latin, maybe Greek, little oak. Dryas means little oak. Well, these are not little oaks, but the leaves have an oak, kind of an oak-like quality. So that's where those names come from. Avens, I looked it up, I forget. Oh yeah, Avens. Oh yeah. Fortunately, I have it here. It means a type of clover. Avens means a type of clover. This is not a clover. So the names, they aren't necessarily direct connection to the plant. It's not an oak, it's not a clover. That's what the names mean. This is a beautiful plant. It's common at Whistler Pass on Tiffany. Just FYI, for your information, if you live here or if you come over to the Met House, I would say last week of June, maybe first week of July, in that time period. And then if you can take a trail up from Whistler Pass up to the top of Tiffany, and this is all over that trail, all along that trail. So it's not uncommon in the Met House. That's just one place I'm familiar with it. But so here's this plant, and it's beautiful, and it's fun to know it. It's fun to know the name. It's delightful to see it. It's also interesting to have information about plants. I don't know why that is. It seems to deepen our sense of appreciation for the plant. So this plant has been involved in interpreting the climate of the Earth over the last 14,000 years. It's because the pollen of this plant has been found in the lowlands in Europe, in various strata, presumably in sediment in ponds is probably where they find it. But the paleontologists are expert. They can tell what genus pollen is from, often what species pollen is from. They have found this pollen advancing and retracting in the lowlands of Europe, and the explanation that they came up with from that is this graph. This is a graph of the last 16,000 years of the climate, generally the planetary climate. It might be most accurate for Europe because that's where the pollen was found. But the ice age came to an end about 15,000 years ago. I mean, it warmed up. So number 1 shows the warming at the end of the last ice age. And it warmed, it doesn't have, I presume that temperature scale is Celsius. I can't go back to where I found this. I could find it, but I didn't go look for it. But I just have the graphic right now, probably Celsius. But that means that temperature range is greater in Fahrenheit, and the total range there is 15 or 20 degrees Fahrenheit from the bottom to the top. So we need to be informed that climate changes over time. And at the end of the last ice age, it was very dramatic, and that graph shows it. And that is a record interpreted from the pollen of Dryas octopetala. So what it shows there is that spike on the left of high temperature, and then it plummeted back down again. There's a number 3 there, and that is the oldest Dryas. So the term you might be familiar with is the younger Dryas. Younger Dryas. It's named after that plant. And that was the coldest period, and it's at the bottom of that graph. It's labeled Younger Dryas cooling, but there was an oldest and an older, so 3 and 5, and then it really plummeted into the Younger Dryas, and there were glacial advances again during the Younger Dryas, and then it warmed up, and it stayed warmer, but it didn't stay warm. If you look at that top graph, the last 10,000 years, climate varies all the time. There was a little ice age, that started in 1700, approximately 700. It ended in 1900, 100 years ago. The Little Ice Age ended 100 years ago. They had trouble growing crops in Europe because of the Little Ice Age. It's just a fact. So some more plants. This is a great plant, spotted saxifrage. It's a cliff plant. So I started to say I didn't quite finish that. Just pointing out there's different habitats in the mountains. I mean, it's obvious, but my mind doesn't tend to think that way until it's pointed out that there's various habitats. There's fell fields, there's ridges, there's cliff habitats, there's wet meadows, and there's snow beds. There may be more, but their different plant species are adapted to different environments. And once that is pointed out, to me, it became fun to look. So this plant often grows on bare rock. I don't know how it does it, and it can grow on north slopes where it gets very little sunlight. I don't know why it grows upright like that, because it's a tough environment. But the really notable thing about spotted saxifrage is the flower. So this is what a flower looks like in spotted saxifrage. Many of you know this, but again, you have to helps to have your hand lens and get down your hands and knees and look at it. And I can only presume, I cannot interpret those spots. They've got to be a way of communicating to the pollinator how to align the insect's body to get to the nectar, which then puts the body in the proper position to both gather pollen or deliver pollen if it's been to another flower or another plant. But the colors, because they're sort of reddish and yellowish, and those aren't great colors for red. But if you'd have to take a picture of this in ultraviolet light to get even a vague sense of what this looked like to an insect. Fortunately, we're not trying to align our bodies properly. We can just enjoy the beauty of that flower. Well, here's the all-time stellar flower of the alpine environment, purple saxifrage, Saxifraga oppositifolia. See, those little leaves are opposite one another. And you almost have to risk your life to see this plant because it really only grows on north-facing cliffs, steep cliffs. So you can see this on Tiffany by going to the summit and then walking, I would say it's pretty much walk north from the summit along the ridge and look into the couloirs, the clefts in the rock, and there are steep walls there, and it has Saxifraga oppositifolia on it, and you don't have to risk your life to see it, but it grows in such steep places that it can be very difficult to find. An odd thing about this plant is it is one of the first flowers to bloom in the alpine zone, and I do not understand how that can be the case, except that the peak of solar gain is on June 21st, and it blooms at the end of June. So that may be, well, the one thing that struck me, maybe that's the only time the sun hits these things, when it's at its zenith, at the summer solstice. And while it gets warmer after that because of seasonal lag, you don't get any more sunshine. You get less sunshine after that. This is a circumboreal plant, which means it grows all over the northern hemisphere in northern environments. So it's in Europe and Siberia. And an odd fact when you read about it is it's considered an edible to the Eskimos. Now can't swear to that. They eat the flowers. How much of a meal can you make out of those flowers? It says they're quite tasty, and that they're particularly tasty when they're mixed with whale blubber. So keep that in mind. I've never eaten one, but it's not much of a meal, I can tell you that. So this is a plant. If you're mountain people, you know it. Mountain sorrel. It's in the buckwheat family, and I would presume it's wind pollinated. So Oxyria, once again, Oxyria etymology comes out meaning sour. Well, if you know this plant, it's edible. It's very sour. It tastes like it has vinegar on it, but it tastes good. It's tasty, and it's high in vitamin C. Very common in the alpine zone. The leaves are edible, always edible. A lot of plants aren't edible after they flower, but this one remains just sour and tasty. I like eating a leaf or two as I walk along. And then I looked at that word digyna, And I realized I didn't have to look it up, that it must have two pistils. Di is obviously two, and gyna, I forget the longer term. But it's wind pollinated, and I haven't really looked at it but to see if there's two gynas. Anyhow, that's where that name comes from. And what is that plant? What is that plant down below? I was looking at that this morning and I couldn't quite figure it out. It might, I don't know what that is. Anyhow, this is a great alpine plant. And if you know what that is, you can put it in the chat box. So more environments. That mountain sorrel grows in the cliffs, like the spotted saxifrage, not necessarily, well, even on north-facing cliffs, not on sheer cliffs the way purple saxifrage grows, but it's a cliff plant. But this is a wet meadow plant, and if you've been in the mountains, you know this plant because it's a showstopper. I'm always delighted. I mean, you can tell these little tufts of leaves in a wet meadow in June and July, and I look at it and I know that's gentian, and I get this warm fuzzy feeling. That's such a beautiful plant, and I'm happy to see it. But it's a late bloomer. It blooms, I would say, in early August, maybe the end of July, early August. The season comes to an end by the last week of August. It's going to go down to 25 degrees and put an end to reproduction. So plants are constrained by the season, and there are advantages and disadvantages to how they respond to those constraints. If you bloom early, Saxifraga oppositifolia blooms the last week of June. There's no pollinators. It's too cold. They haven't emerged yet. I mean, there are a few. There have to be a few, but that's the main disadvantage. There's very few pollinators in late June and early July. In late July and early August, there's a lot of pollinators, but your seeds have to fully develop. There's a biological process that has to continue. It has to be enough warmth to carry that to completion. And studies have been done, and plants that bloom late often don't ripen their seeds. So it's just a tenuous toehold they have on existence. So this plant, I think there's another picture of it here. This is a serious bumblebee plant. I saw a list of species that pollinate this plant, and they're all bumblebees. It was like a list of 5 different bumblebee species. Look at the shape. It's shaped like a bumblebee. And I have actually many times looked inside one, and there's a bumblebee down inside the flower. So bumblebees are the all-time great pollinators. They can fly at somewhat lower temperatures. They can raise their body temperatures by exercising their wing muscles. They can actually, I think, detach their wing muscles from their wings so they can activate their wing muscles, and the wings aren't going. And actually, they do that with buzz pollination, which I think comes up here with a flower. We talked about buzz pollination. That's where they vibrate the flower at a certain frequency, and that frequency is very close to middle C. You can take a tuning fork up and pollinate your own flowers if you want. So the bumblebees do that, but they also can warm their bodies by exercising those wing muscles and by metabolism. They're burning the hydrocarbons from the food they've eaten, from the sugar and then maybe the pollen they've eaten. So it's the same thing that the avalanche lily did to warm up, just metabolizing the energy, which is the energy captured by the sun in photosynthesis. I mean, it is interesting to always remember that's what powers life on Earth, is the energy of the sun. Pedicularis, what a genus of strange plants. It's as if they're trying to emulate the animal kingdom. Of course they aren't. But elephant's head on the left and bird's beak on the right, and so that's the one on the left is Pedicularis groenlandica, so it's named after Greenland, but the other one is Ornithorhynchus, which means bird beak. And those are shapes. We've talked a little bit about it in the other programs, but when you have a bilateral complex shape, I would say probably always limits the animals, mostly insects, that can pollinate it. A radial flower that is wide open to the sun, like a buttercup or a cinquefoil, can be pollinated by any insect. And the problem with any insect is they might not be as loyal to that species, whereas something like a bumblebee, which is what it's going to take to pollinate a pedicularis, will go from one elephant's head to the next elephant's head to the next elephant's head plant more dependably and carry that and more dependably pollinate that plant. And that's probably why these complicated shapes have evolved. One other interesting point about, so pedicularis means louse. These are called louseworts. You remember that? Pedicularis, the pedicularis are louseworts. So I thought the reason for that was that they would repel lice. But I have put them in my shirt sleeves and they've never repelled my lice. But it turns out it means that the belief is, I think it's just the belief system that when livestock eat pedicularis, they get lice. And that seems highly unlikely to me, but that's what it says online. Anyhow, pedicularis does mean louse, and the plant is called lousewort, and any actual relationship to lice is probably imaginary, like much of human existence. The other interesting thing about this genus is, I didn't realize it until, looking into this now, they're hemiparasites, partial parasites. They're parasitic on other plants. And they're, I guess we would call it facultative. They're not required to be parasites, but they often are parasitic. They also are photosynthetic, so they can produce their own food. So they can go both ways. And then I ran into, when reading about it, that the writer felt compelled to say that, parasitism always seems slightly distasteful to the human sensibilities. The writer pointed out it's not a bad thing, that they're parasitic on the dominant plants in the meadows that they grow in. They reduce the strength. They reduce the strength of the dominant plants and they increase the biodiversity of the flora. Might be more conceptual than actual, but it's an interesting thought that it just increases the biodiversity of the species in that habitat. So I mentioned snow beds. Here's a diagram of snow beds. And again, ever since this has been pointed out to me, when I see them, I think, that's a snow bed. And it's fun to know that. It's fun to then look it over. Snow beds are low places in the landscape where snow collects a little more deeply in the winter, lasts longer in the spring and into the early summer, so that it creates another extremely challenging environment for plants to exist in. The season is shorter, the soil is cold when the snow melts, and it's saturated. So how are plants going to grow there? The lower picture shows a very generalized diagram of what you're going to find in snowbed communities, and they're going to be populated often by sedge. We have a sedge called, I have a picture of it coming up, Carex nigricans. I think it's nigricans means black. I think it's called black sedge, but it's rhizomaceous, which means it reproduces by underground. I think rhizomes are actually stems, but they're underground. They're like roots, but it reproduces from those. It'll go away and come up and go away and come up. It's asexual reproduction, but it doesn't need to bloom. It does bloom, but if the blooming season is too short, the plant still can reproduce. They're also adapted to that wet environment, which must be a low oxygen environment. And then it might be rushes, might not be, and then some other plants that you tend to find, like the willows. So it's just an interesting phenomenon to know about. Here's not my favorite picture of snow bed, but these things come up and I realized, my God, I've seen 100 snow beds and I've never taken a picture of one. So I had to take this off the web. They're often a lot smaller, just little dips in the ground. But this was offered as a snow bed online. But here's that black alpine sedge, Carex nigricans. So those are the way those things sticking out are the female reproductive structures, really the ovaries, perigynia. The black parts sticking up are anthers stuck together, male reproductive structure. And it may or may not successfully reproduce because the season is so short, but it doesn't matter because it can reproduce asexually. And the willows, this is snow willow, Salix nivalis, will grow at the edge of a snow bed. They don't have much time. They can't be very big. So snow willow is about 2 inches high. And I put a penny in there to show how big snow willow is. And again, I don't know what's so delightful about miniature plants, but they warm the cockles of your heart every time you see them. And willows they're just delightful. When I realize these tiny little plants, they're willows. Really fun. Alpine laurel. It also grows in wet meadows, quite common in the wet meadows of the alpine, I would say more subalpine zone. It's poisonous. It's in the heather family, which is a surprise to me somewhat. But the most interesting little tidbit to me about alpine laurel is that the anthers are embedded in little divots in the petals, and they're stuck there. And when they're ripe, when a pollinator visits and the anthers are ripe, the petal springs forth forcefully and pounds the, the pollinator on the butt probably and delivers the pollen to the insect. And you can do that. You can manipulate the flower yourself. So it's something to do while you're in the alpine zone, is manipulate the stamens and anthers of alpine laurel. Beautiful, beautiful little plant. So we're in the heather family, Ericaceae. I looked that up. I think Ericaceae, they weren't sure. They think it means heather from Greek or Latin. But it has interesting aspects. Heather grows. I think Ericaceae. I don't know if I can find it. Number 23. Okay, so Erica is a word meaning heather, but heather comes from an Old English word meaning wasteland. And that's the interesting point, is that the heathers tend to grow in difficult environments. They tend to grow in rocky environments, and they tend to grow in acidic soil where other plants can't grow. You know, if you get up into the lodgepole pine with its rocky acidic soil, it's got that Vaccinium scopularum so commonly, carpets of that little, we call it whortleberry or grouseberry, you know, the little tiny little Vaccinium, because the heather family knows how to grow in acidic soil and poor soil. And why is that? The reason is, I think it's invariably in a symbiotic relationship with mycorrhizal fungi. In fact, there is a family of mycorrhizal fungi, the ericoid mycorrhiza. So ericoid is the erica, the Ericaceae, the heathers, the heather fungi. They've co-evolved with the heather family to work together to make life possible in this challenging environment. So the plant supplies food to the fungus and the fine mycorrhizal hairs, which form symbiotic relationships. I think they even enter into the roots, endomycorrhiza, they enter into the roots of the heathers, are able to access the nutrients that the plant needs. You know, the common ones, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and who knows what else, from this challenging rocky soil environment. So this particular blueberry, you know, it's very low. I don't think it gets higher than 6 inches. It gets these huge berries on it. And it's Vaccinium deliciosum. You can probably interpret deliciosum. It's a great berry, and it's important food for vertebrates in August and September, because it's a high energy food source. It's abundant, I would say, produces almost every year, and not uncommon to find bears up in the Vaccinium deliciosum in August. Probably by September, they're starting to dry up. So you can look for grizzly bears up, but you're not going to find them because we don't have any grizzly bears. And that's been pretty well proven. The anthers of a lot of the Ericaceae, I'm not clear on whether it's all of them, but they only, in the Vacciniums, that's what they look like. They only open by a pore. And I think they're buzz pollinated. You can't get the pollen. You can't get the pollen out of that tiny little pore unless you shake it at middle C. I've looked at these a little bit, and I've seen it's almost always bumblebees on them. Same thing. I put in, it's obviously the same drawing, but I think they have the same buzz pollination anther design. It's a common design in the heather family. It's a great plant, as you know, it's just beautiful. So another habitat we haven't talked about is scree. This is Scatter Lake, beloved to many Manhattan inhabitants, but hard to get to. It's only 5 miles. That trail is so steep. It's just ferocious, but it's a lovely place. And so scree, the problem with scree is it moves. How's the plant going to grow? Well, you can see in the forefront there are some plants. And here's a common plant at Scatter Lake and in scree. And you can see it is not just a fell field, but it's on a slope, and that those rocks are moving over time. And exactly how they do it, I don't know. I would guess that, this is a wonderful plant, Phacelia serratia, silky Phacelia. I would guess it's taprooted and just has has a strong hold, but it's got to be adapted to that environment. So another interesting thing about silky Phacelia is it grows pretty well in a home garden. So if you find this plant in seed, you can bring the seeds home and plant them and have some success. It's easier to grow than a lot of alpine plants. And I was able to grow it. I think I had it in a garden for 2 or 3 years before it gave up the ghost, but it may even be a short-term perennial. Maybe that was natural. Anyhow, it's a wonderful plant to find up in the high country. You can see it's typical of the, certainly of the genus, to have the anthers exerted. They stick way out of the flowers. You can pretty well bet you're looking at Phacelia. I'm actually forgetting what family it's in. So this is a great little plant in the alpine zone in the Sawtooth Range called Star Peak Fleabane. And an interesting thing about this, plant is it was only identified in the 1980s. It wasn't recognized it wasn't even known, probably because it's not widespread. It's very difficult to find this plant. But it was found by, I have my BC botany book here, by George Douglas, BC botany. George Douglas found this, I think, in the 1980s, and he found it on Star Peak. So if you live in the Methow, especially if you're up Twist River, you may know that's where Star Peak is. So he found it on Star Peak. It's just a stupendous alpine plant. That's how big it gets. And it's hard. There's not a lot of it. Hard to find the tufts, hard to find it in bloom, but it's a unique plant for our area. And I put this plant in for 2 reasons. One is I showed you Erigeron linearis in the lowlands. They look very similar. The leaves are a little different. The flower looks very similar. The composite design that we've talked about, many tiny flowers all jammed together. I just found these little yellow flowers to be the most cheerful flowers in the world. That includes our lowland one, Erigeron linearis, but that one dries up and you can go up a little higher and find Erigeron aureus. Aureus means golden. I meant to look up Erigeron. I forget what it means, but you can find these things out. So we're closing in on time and plants, but I wanted to show you a few, I forget how things unfold here, but this cushion plant was so striking. I think I got this picture off of that PDF program I showed in the first or second slide, but just the alpine plants from around the world are quite striking. This is an Androsaceae. That's the genus Androsaceae, but it is your quintessential cushion plant. And that is just a common growth form. This is a little more extreme, but a common growth form in the alpine zone because it protects the plant. It's bunched together, it's low to the ground, it's not going to wave around in the wind. It's a growth form that works in the alpine zone. And I don't know what the flowers look like on that, but it's just such a striking. This is in Europe. Yeah, it shows that. Yes. So I inserted just a little bit of my own adventuring, and I mentioned in a previous slideshow, I was in northern Iraq in 2008 in Suleimania, and I was with a group called Nature Iraq. I was volunteering for them, and so they were going out, And we often went to lakes and looked at wildlife. They have these big reservoirs there, but we took 1 or 2 hikes in the mountains. So this is a mountain called Pere Magrun outside of Sulemania, and by God, we got to take a hike up in the mountains. And I got to this point, and once you're a botanist, if you see, so off on the left is a cliff. It's in the shade, not the one in the background. I wasn't going to climb that cliff, but there was an upright cliff. It was the most rugged spot we'd seen. We'd been hiking over fell fields and talus, scree, and I knew I had to go to that cliff. Once you're a botanist, you just have to go to cliffs. You don't have to climb them. You just have to go there. And I went there, and this is what I found. Oh, this is not what I found. The next picture is what I found. But these plants are on Paramagrin, and I found it so fascinating that a number of the plants that are in our gardens, either as food plants or as flowering plants, they just grow in the wild in the Middle East, because that's where human agriculture and human society began, and that's where they began to accumulate these plants from the wild. There were tulips. There were tulips growing wild in the mountains in this very same place, and they only grew between the cracks in the rocks, because otherwise the feral pigs would dig them out and eat them. So I need the rocks to protect them. Anyhow, I was fascinated to run into this, but this is what I found. Dionysia. I'd never heard of Dionysia, and it is a stellar alpine genus. There are people, I think, who spent their life tracking down the numerous species of Dionysia, and it's not easy to do because most of them are in Iraq and Iran, as far as I know. Anyhow, I ran into this one. This was on that little cliff, and I was just so thrilled to see this plant. And I have a file on Dionysia now, but I don't remember much more about it other than it's beautiful, and it totally made my day. This is in Kabul, in Afghanistan, and we're not going into any detail. I'm just complexifying both the human predicament and the biology of the planet. Flowers are everywhere. When I was in Afghanistan, we were on a ride once in a little jitney bus going north out of Kabul. You can't go very far north, but we went a ways, and all of a sudden there were these what do they make saffron out of? You can't tell me because you're all muted. They make it out of the anthers of saffron. It's a very common plant, but I forget what we call it. They're not tulips. There were just fields of them. And I said, you've got to stop the bus. You've got to stop the bus. And we got out and took pictures of them. Anyhow, this is not that plant. Yeah, somebody's coming through there for me. This is an anemone. It's in Kabul, But Kabul is in this extremely hilly. If you've ever seen pictures of Kabul, they have almost mountains right in town, and the houses go right up, and they're made out of the rocks that are, and you get poorer and poorer. Unlike in the United States, you have to be richer and richer to go up higher. In Kabul, it's poorer and poorer. They don't have any water. Anyhow, we went up there, and this thing was growing out of the rocks, and I was touched. And I was at a girls' school for a little while, and this is Zahra looking at one of her flowers. That's probably a flower from her tree. It looks like a fruit tree flower. She's got my very own hand lens. I can recognize the lanyard. And really, the point is only that this is what these kids could be doing. Instead of struggling to survive, they could be learning about this miraculous planet that they've been born into, that not only is it miraculous, but it's bizarre. So here's a plant from Tierra del Fuego called the Happy Alien. I just had to show it to you. Calceolaria, some kind of slipper. So they call this Darwin's slipper. Darwin actually found this plant. Now, I can tell you, the people who live, the Tierra del Fuegans, already knew about this plant. Darwin did not discover it, but Darwin found it in terms of Western society. And so they call it Darwin's slipper. And I don't think he actually wore them, but what a bizarre and stupendous little plant. We're near the end. I forget where it goes from here. Yeah. The larger picture, so there are these plants and they're delight to the eye. And we enjoy learning about them and seeing their beauty and learning their name, but there's more to it. They are the primary source of life on the planet. Plants are probably 90% of the biomass on the planet. I mean, maybe you could argue that's not counting bacteria. We don't know the weight of bacteria. You can't weigh bacteria. And there's a lot of bacteria underground. We don't know. In terms of the life you can see, and it's because they are autotrophs. They make their own food out of carbon dioxide and water and sunlight. It's a magic trick. You can try it at home. It won't work. Humans try it. Humans can, break water apart to produce hydrogen, which then becomes a fuel, but it takes more energy, fossil fuel energy, natural gas, to break the water apart than you get back when you burn that hydrogen, which you do by reuniting with oxygen. So, can appreciate plants. Primary biomass. Plants change the chemistry of the atmosphere. The atmosphere is 21% oxygen. It's all put there by photosynthetic organism, probably 50% plants and 50% algae and cyanobacteria in the ocean. They changed that. There was no oxygen. There would be no oxygen. It's highly reactive with other elements, but plants are constantly pumping into the atmosphere. And the other, 78% is nitrogen. And that is processed through plants, but it's bacteria that pump it into the atmosphere. Plants are a geologic force. We don't think in these terms, but think of all the carbon that is sequestered. I've seen the numbers. I should have dug them up, but I didn't. But the amount of carbon sequestered in sedimentary rock in the Earth's crust is far greater than the amount of carbon in the Earth's atmosphere. Now, we are concerned about digging up the carbon that we can access in fossil fuels, but that is a very small amount compared to the total amount of carbon which we cannot access and may not be in a form that we could burn. It's not natural gas or petroleum, but it's plants that created this carbon rich material that was then sequestered. So they are a geologic force, probably millions of tons of sediment based on carbon. Plants make terrestrial animal life possible. They produce all the food. They're the autotrophs. They make the food. The heterotrophs, other feeding. The animals eat the plants. Plants make the food. It says terrestrial because there's not much plant life in the ocean. There's a lot of photosynthesis, but it's algae and cyanobacteria. We mentioned that briefly, I think, with diatoms. Diatoms are algae. They're major producers of oxygen. Plants are the source of fossil fuels. They're one of the sources of fossil fuels, especially coal. We mentioned that the coal is largely made up of club moss. Club moss today grows, 3 inches tall. It used to be 100 feet tall. Club moss used to be 100 feet tall, and can't remember the name. Other plants that used to be much bigger and are now smaller. This is an interesting one. So it was the human discovery of fire, which was probably first discovered by Homo erectus, a genus that preceded us by probably at least 1 million years. Homo erectus probably discovered fire and the ability to use fire. Once a creature, we'll say the genus Homo, encountered the ability to cook its food, it made far more energy and nutrients available from that food to the bodies that were cooking that food. And it's thought that not the discovery of fire, but enlisting fire for cooking food enabled the rapid expansion of the human brain. Fire enabled the rapid expansion of the human brain because of the access to increased nutrient flow. What do we burn? We burn plants. It's the energy embodied in plants. It's the energy of the sun stored in plants that we burn in fire that made the evolution of Homo sapiens possible. Just interesting to contemplate. It's these stories, they just go as deep as you want to go. So now we're just going into the artistic quality of life in plants and the perfection of these evolved forms. So these are stigmas. of several plant species. It says up top, hibiscus, purslane, and geranium close-ups. I mean, the more you look, the more you see. That's why you need a hand lens. Pollen on anthers, a work of art. Beautiful. I don't know what species that is. The pollen is transferred to the animal kingdom, mostly to insects. We then take it to other plants, but create a bit of a work of art if you can see what's going on. The pollen itself is stunning under a microscope. It never stops. There's no end to the intricacy of life on the planet and even to the dynamics of the planet. I'm now incorporating geology because it has the same level of complexity. So look at these pollen grades. They're just magnificent. So I almost took this out because it's a little bit controversial, but I'm just covering not just, the flora, but our interaction with the flora. So, what the world needs are deep ecologists. We need to grow in our own ecological understanding of the planet. And instead, the world's resources are going into this aggressiveness that is obviously genetically encoded in, I would say, you could almost say all living things. I mean, even plants are aggressive. But the thing is, life is an emergent journey. It's a journey. Nothing stays the same. We don't have to stay stuck with this aggressiveness. We could become ecologists that steward this phenomenal planet that we have been given the opportunity to live on. So here's a quote by Teilhard de Chardin. Ever more perceptive eyes in a world in which there's always more to see. Get a hand lens, more to see. Binoculars, more to see. Microscope, more to see. Take a walk, more to see. This is Shea Crandall when he was little at Freeze Out Pass. Up at the top, it says, all the wild world is beautiful and it matters little where we go. I don't know if you can see it. It's a little bit blocked out for me. John Muir. It doesn't matter. You don't have to. Everything is so beautiful. And then this great quote, a favorite quote of mine by John Muir. All I need to do to get ready for an adventure is throw some bread and tea in a sack and jump over the back fence. Hey, it's spring, so we're ready to take off here.
Wonderful, wunderbar. You just made my day. I'll tell you what, and I'm sure you made a lot of other people's day. That was wonderful. I love that you included flowers from Afghanistan and beyond, and then your little slideshow at the very end of the artsy one. I mean, it's just like you see where Dr. Zeus was inspired.
Yeah, I should check the chat box. Somebody's going to, for me, horsetails. I couldn't remember the name horsetails. Horsetails used to be almost 100 feet tall. Now they're small plants, but a lot of the coal deposits, which are immense, still immense after digging them for 100 years, they're immense, are largely horsetails and club moss, which used to be trees and are not any longer. So we can look at plants produce the oxygen and fuel. That's right. When we burn wood, it's recombining oxygen with the hydrogen that got stuck onto the carbon and creating water. And where did the oxygen come from? It came from the plants that we're burning. It's a cycle. It's a complete cycle. So I'm amused and irritated because they'll say the process of photosynthesis gives off oxygen as a waste product. It's not a waste product. It's part of an integral cycle of the dynamics of life on the planet. Carolyn says also, I'm not sure what, also what. Okay, oh yeah, Phacelia is in the waterleaf family. That sounds right. Hydrophalaceae, waterleaf family. I knew it, I knew that. Yeah, Rob Stevens, crocus, robin, crocus. So that's what they make saffron out of. And it was just these fields of crocuses in Afghanistan. And we're driving along a bus and the Taliban might blow you to pieces. And here's these fields of flowers. It's just unbelievable. Just unbelievable. I mean, we were safe, but we could only go 25 miles out of town, and then we had to go back. That was in 2000. 14. It's less safe now, but that, you know, we're not really talking about that. It's just interesting. Carolyn's a winner. Lone Pine Alpine Plants are the Pacific. Oh, that's it. Lone Pine with the publisher. Alpine Plants, the Pacific Northwest. Great book. Yeah. There's a book on alpine plants published by Lone Pine by those hotshot Canadian botanists. Yeah. And he's pointing out, Dale is pointing out the cycle that the plants not only produce the wood, they also produce the oxygen. They don't produce the oxygen. The oxygen was produced in the Big Bang, but they liberate the oxygen into the atmosphere. Okay. We covered it. Okay.
Yeah, do you want to quit sharing the screen and people could unmute themselves if they had any last comments or anything? There you go.
Yeah, if anybody wants to argue. Anyhow, it's fun to think of just how endlessly intricate the world is. And, you know, we all get wrapped up in personal issues. And if there's any way out, it's nice to find our way out because it's a beautiful world. I was thinking of that great quote. I may put it on the next Naturalist. So Desiderata, besides in spite of all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it's still a beautiful world. That's just great.
And so are you. Yay. Well, that was it for Wildflowers. Boy, we learned so much. Thank you, Dana. Wow. Is anybody else?
Thank you for the opportunity.
Last comments for Dana before we say goodbye? Nada.
Well, thanks for hanging around this long. It's wonderful to see you, and thank you for joining in. Almost got a note there from Dale, but it went away about a book. He might have been recommending alpine plants. I'm not sure.
Oh, it says.
Anyhow, thanks everybody for joining in. It makes my day to be able to just talk about something as interesting as alpine plants. So see you down the road.
Yeah. Happy gardening. All right. Take care. Bye-bye.